I think it piggybacks nicely on the reading that you just heard Sean read from the Epistle of James. As here the disciples were on their way down from the mountain where they had witnessed the transfiguration. And they were just totally astounded. We're not sure quite what they had just seen. But instead of asking about what it was that they had seen, they start bickering with one another, wondering who was the greatest. And Jesus takes this opportunity to illustrate the point about God's kingdom being different from this kingdom that we live in. And so he welcomes a little child among them. Hear this reading from Mark's Gospel. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching the disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands. They will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. And then he sat down and called the 12 and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child, and he put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Do you remember what it was like to be a little child? Do you remember what it was like to have that feeling of having to reach up to hold someone's hand, to hold your mother's hand? Do you remember what it felt like to be surrounded by knees? I think Mr. Rogers probably had a very distinct memory of what it was like to be a child. Why else was he always stooping down to eye level with these tiny people? I have very fond memories of sitting on the floor with my two sons, waiting for Mr. Rogers to come on and singing along with "It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood," and waiting for the good news of Mr. Rogers to brighten our day. I think if there had been TV back in Jesus' time, that Jesus would have had a show for kids too. You'd think he had a thing for children. Like Mr. Rogers, Jesus did not see children as many adults in training, but he saw in them the very kingdom of God. He saw their vulnerability, their smallness, their dependency on the kindness of others, and their low status in the Greco-Roman social chart. The context in our passage from Mark's Gospel is this. Jesus had just taken the disciples up to the mountain where he is transfigured, shining like a luminary, along with what appeared to be Elijah and Moses. Well, you all know the story. The disciples had just witnessed this amazing encounter, and they were privileged to see Jesus transform before their eyes, and they heard the very voice of God, claiming Jesus to be God's Son, proclaiming him blessed, beloved, and telling the disciples to listen to this one. But here, they're coming down the mountain, and Jesus again tells them of his impending crucifixion and resurrection. He had done this just a few chapters before, verses before, when we heard that last week, and he's telling them again, but they don't seem to get it. They don't understand what has just occurred. And like a truly dysfunctional family, they start to argue about who would be the chairman of the board, since Jesus was no longer going to be in charge. They're arguing about who's going to get the best disciple of the month plaque in the parking spot. There is a time to speak speak and a time to keep silent. So the author of Ecclesiastes 3 tells us. The disciples were caught speaking when they should have been keeping silent. And they kept silent when they should have confessed to their arguing, and at least asked Jesus what he meant about that crucifixion that he was talking about and the rising again. And when they get to the house, Jesus asked them, "Now what were you arguing about?" Well, that's a rhetorical question. If he knew they were arguing, he probably heard what they were arguing about. Like little school children caught passing notes in class, they kept silent. They were embarrassed because they had been talking about who would be the greatest. But notice what Jesus does. Rather than shame the disciples about their refusal to hear about the truth of his message, he used their rivalry as a teaching opportunity to instruct them about the greatness in the kingdom of God. Jesus sits down in the middle of the floor of the house where they were staying, where the kids were all playing with probably stick toys on a mud floor. It doesn't look like a thing a Messiah would do. But they know, the disciples know, that Jesus is about to tell them something that they don't want to miss hearing. So right there, he reaches out and pulls a little girl that the other kids had been teasing. Now, it doesn't say it was a little girl, but I imagine it was a little girl. Because little girls were even lower than little boys on that totem pole. And he puts his arms around her. A strange thing for a bachelor to do, if you think about it. And he tells them, whoever is first must be last. And if you want to welcome God, if you want to welcome me, you have to welcome this little one in my lap. Not only do we see the stunned faces of the disciples, we also see the humility of Jesus and his kind actions to someone who was the lowest of the low in that particular culture. Back then, parents didn't dress their kids in gymboree clothes and Tommy Hilfiger outfits. There was no special programming for the children or groups like Mother's Morning Out. Children were liabilities until they were old enough to make a living and keep their aging parents from bankruptcy. In fact, they were not even considered human until the age of 8. Do you think that the disciples had even noticed that child before Jesus brought her into his arms? Jesus' humility proves to be authentic humility. Jesus seems to be showing the disciples that God overturns social hierarchies and welcomes the small and the unimportant in the world and into God's embrace. And for the disciples, this was a very difficult thing to hear. But I don't think it was only the disciples who have a hard time hearing this. I think it is especially hard for us to hear in our me-first culture that seems to have everyone vying for the microphone or the spotlight. We've seen civil discourse take a backseat to raging, angry, me-first dominant voices. From the tennis great Serena Williams' profanity-laced tirade threatening to shove a tennis ball down the referee's throat for calling a fault. Kanye West stealing the microphone from country singer Taylor Swift while she was making an acceptance speech for her Best Video Award. To the joint congressional meeting